Always enjoy the discussion with Mike LaValle from Last Word on College Football. Join him there for college football coverage with himself and the rest of the staff. Close friends of Mark Rogers TV. Subscribe to my YouTube channel right here. And, of course, go to Podbean, iTunes, and Stitcher for the audio versions of these conversations. So, Mike, on a weekend in the SEC, week 3, where South Carolina, we may have thought a little bit too much of them. They lose at home against Kentucky on a Saturday night. The Wildcats vault themselves to 3-0. We see an LSU team that dominated BYU, but the Cougars may not be as good as they typically are. Fall flat on its face at Mississippi State and losing by 4+ touchdowns. Ole Miss goes to the West Coast and loses a Power 5 matchup with a better than expected Cal team. Your thoughts about what happened in the SEC or nationally over the last few days?
It wasn't a good weekend for the SEC. The Ole Miss Cal was not too bad of a loss, coming off of a couple intra-conference or a couple interconferences win over the first 2 weeks. The one that really shocked me was the Purdue dismantling of Missouri. That offense has some tremendous athletes. With Drew Lock, Demarier Crockett, they got a receiver out there who's first class as well, and they just got manhandled by Purdue. And so really, when you talk about the strength of the SEC, usually what separates the SEC from the other conferences is the strength of the back end of the conference. Now, Vanderbilt had a great showing against Kansas State, but that Missouri loss to Purdue was quite frankly embarrassing, and the Ole Miss loss to Cal shows that the back end of the SEC is probably no longer as good as the back end of the other conferences. You got to think Cal is probably the 6th, 7th, 8th, or even worse team in Pac-12. You got Washington State, Stanford, Utah, Colorado, and then USC and UCLA. So that's 6. So you got to think Cal is probably 7 or 8 in that conference. Ole Miss is probably 12-ish in the SEC. You look at Missouri, they're probably 14, but Purdue's 14 in the Big Ten, and Purdue just absolutely smoked Missouri yesterday. So it was not a good day for the SEC, particularly with the interconference games, and then LSU, who's kind of a marquee brand, going up to Starkville, and they got manhandled by Nick Fitzgerald as well. So we'll see. But I really think the era of the SEC being the best conference in college football is slowly coming to a close. The ACC looks really strong. They've got a ton of teams that are competing for the top 25. The Pac-12 looks firm this year. Washington State has not managed to lose to an FCS team yet. And the Big 12 looks surprisingly strong as well. Texas looked good last night. West Virginia looks good even after their loss to Virginia Tech. Oklahoma State is a legit contender for the college football playoffs. That quarterback there in Stillwater is out of his mind playing well. I think he's going to be in the Heisman conversation. I think he'll be in the conversation for the top overall draft pick. If you just look at him in the pocket with that arm and that size, I've had a chance to watch him. He's played, I think, a game on Thursday and a game on Friday. He looks great out there. So I think the Big 12, TCU. So you got TCU, Oklahoma State, Texas, and West Virginia. You got 50% of the Big 12 who has looked good, or at least looked good in week 2. Obviously, Texas didn't look good in week 1. But I think the Big 12 is stronger. I think the ACC is stronger. I think the Pac-12 is stronger this year. So I think overall, after 3 weeks, it looks like the SEC is just kind of no longer the clear-cut best conference in the nation. I think we're getting to an era of parity in college football, where the conferences are really about even across the board right now.
I ran the numbers the first 2 weeks. I have yet to look at week 3 and then combine all the totals. But, for 7 or 8 years, the SEC was decidedly the best conference. We've had that conversation many times, and I will argue that the national groupthink was a little too heavy, that the SEC was out in front, but it was clearly the best conference. And now it's been a debate over the last 2 or 3 years, but most notably, it's just been an SEC, ACC, Big Ten debate. It's almost a 5-conference debate. I don't know that anyone would say that the Pac-12 is the best conference. And some people weighted toward the top and think those are the only teams and games that matter. So let's just look at the top 3 or 4 teams in each league. I weight it that way. That's where I give it the most emphasis, but I look at the entire league. And like you, I have thought that the SEC was the best league 1 through 14 because of the 4 through 14 spots. Mizzou, Purdue. Now, this isn't going to gain a whole lot of attention nationally. It's simmering under the radar, but Jeff Brom, offensive mind, has gone to Purdue. They annihilated Ohio. And yes, it's a MAC team, but it's a quality MAC program. They annihilated Ohio last week. In week 1, they took Louisville to the last 2 minutes of the game. Purdue did. One of the worst teams in FBS football over the last 5 years. And then they show up in Columbia, Mizzou against Drew Lock and Jamon Moore and company and hold them to 3 points. Now, this was not a game that was similar to, let's say, Florida and Iowa, where it was a 7-3 or 10-3 game in the fourth quarter. Then Florida just tacked on a bunch of touchdowns and it was 30-3. No, it was 28-3 at halftime. Purdue blew them out. And yeah, that one very much surprised me.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's that's indicative of how I don't know, Jeff Bromson's first season. I'm not sure a coach can change a program that fast. You've got a coach that's been in Columbia for 2 years. You got Drew Lock. He's a 2-year starter. Like you said, you got Javon Moore and Demaria Crockett on that offense, and they just come out and they looked horrible. I mean, Purdue just rolled them. So you look at the Big Ten. You look at the Big Ten West. I think that's the worst division in football. Iowa has not looked good. Nebraska got beat by Northern Illinois. I think in the Big Ten West, I think the gap between the best team and the rest of the teams is bigger than any other division, with Wisconsin and the other 6 teams in that division. But the Big Ten East, and maybe Purdue is that good. Maybe Jeff Brom is that good of a coach that he's turned that program around that fast. I mean, they were not good for several years. But I just think it speaks more to Missouri than it does to Purdue. I could be wrong. We'll revisit that week 8, 9, 10. But I mean, that was not good for the SEC. Missouri's performance was embarrassing.
It's difficult for me to separate without crunching numbers and really analyzing a number of divisions. So I'm not very impressed with either Pac-12 division. SEC is extremely good, but UCLA is a bit of a mirage. They just lost to Memphis. The Arizona schools are awful. Colorado's not as good as what they showed last year. They showed their true stripes at the end of last season. They're a 7 or 8 win football team, on and on. Stanford's not what most of us thought that they were. They lost to San Diego State. And there's really not a great team in the Pac-12 North outside of possibly Washington, but we're not going to get a barometer of them outside of 2 or 3 games. I don't know that the Big Ten Western Division is any worse than those 2 divisions, or the ACC Coastal. We'll see how good Miami is. Virginia Tech's a decent club, and then it drops off considerably after that with the likes of Georgia Tech, Virginia, North Carolina are decent teams. Pitt's probably only going to win 5 games. Duke's okay. They're off to a decent start. So it's splitting hairs across the board outside the SEC West and the Big Ten East. It's difficult to come up with anything else. The ACC Atlantic Division, of course, is top heavy with the 2 giants, and Louisville is a really good team, despite what we saw Saturday night. And I think Clemson right now, I don't know if they're the best team in college football, but they need to be ranked number 1 because they have the 2 most impressive wins against quality foes than anyone in college football.
And what about the Big 12 North, Oklahoma State?
Well, it's one conference.
I know, that was a joke.
So it's one conference. Yeah, Oklahoma State. See, the issue that I have is when I rank the teams, I'm going to have one shocker in the top 25. I'm going to release my top 25 here in the next few minutes, and I've got one team that no one will ever have in the top 25. But again, I'm ranking them based on their performance. So there's only a 3-game season to date. So I rank it number 1 on who you've beaten, and I rank most of the undefeated teams high in the rankings. And then I go by performance. And there's a team in the Pac-12 that has yet to lose a game, and they've beaten 2 decent Power 5 teams, but nobody has them sniffing the top 25 right now. And that doesn't mean I think they're a top 25 team. They just have put down a top 10 resume to date. Anyway, yeah, the issue I have with Oklahoma State is, unfortunately, they scheduled the series with Pitt probably 5 to 6 to 8 years ago, and Pitt's not very good, and we're not going to get to see Oklahoma State play the type game that we're getting to see Ohio State, Oklahoma, Alabama, Florida State, fill in the blank, and we'll have to use the transitive property if Oklahoma State wins the Big 12.
Well, Mark, you'll be happy to know that California received 2 votes in our top 25 today.
There you go.
So as soon as you release yours, check out ours, and I think with 2 votes, California is probably sitting at about 32 or 33 in our poll. We usually get about 10 teams that receive, others receiving votes. So as soon as you release your top 25, go check ours out at lastwordoncollegefootball.com. Cal got 2 votes from our voters today.
So I think you can appreciate that line of thinking. Let's go with the
Absolutely.
results, and it'll work itself out when they play better competition, or when they show themselves over a longer period of time and number of games.
Absolutely. They'll get their chance against Oregon that looks good. They'll get their chance against Washington State, who looks good so far. They've managed not to stumble. And they'll get their chance against Washington and Stanford.
Exactly. All right, Mike Laval, last word on college football. Please join him right there with the rest of the crew. They're breaking down college football, and subscribe to my YouTube channel, of course, for the best in college football analysis. All right, Mike, we appreciate you stopping by.
Mark, always a pleasure.